To all current members, new faces, welcome. We'll get started as we usually do with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you want to join me, please stand and we'll say the pledge. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Some quick reminders. Our Memorial Day service is this Saturday, May 28th at 9 a.m. at Rural Cemetery. So it's always a great time. It always is a meaningful ceremony to go out. You know, it's only 45 minutes on a Saturday morning, and it's a good reminder about what Memorial Day is all about. So I encourage all of our members to bring a friend. Come on out on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Mayor Mitchell of New Bedford will be the keynote speaker. There'll be coffee and donuts available after the service, and it is always a meaningful commemoration of the sacrifice of the New Bedford soldiers and sailors who fought in the Civil War, so I encourage you all to come out. Looking at the weather forecast, there's a possibility of rain. We do have a rain date should that happen, and it's the following Saturday, June 4th. Right, Peter?
That's correct.
So the following Saturday. Our June picnic is coming up. We don't have a regular monthly meeting next month. It is the end of our speaking season. So we'll be having our annual June picnic. That's on Tuesday, June 26th at 6 p.m. Same place as we are all gathered here tonight, Royal Tide Yacht Club. Anyone who is interested in a board position, we are in dire need of a secretary. If anybody wants to be a president of the Bedford Civil War Foundation, throw it out there. Let me know if there is any interest in being on the board. We are looking for folks, so if you do have an interest in joining the board, we will be having our annual slate of officers vote at that picnic. So I encourage anyone who's interested to either reach out to me tonight or send me an email or a phone call. Another important announcement, the Joe Langboys Memorial Book Award has been awarded to 2 local students in our area. The first place winner was Evan Garcia of Dartmouth. He won the $500 award, and Philip Tran of New Bedford High School won a second place award for $250. Philip is the first individual that we've ever had even apply from New Bedford. And was certainly a worthy candidate, so Philip won the second place prize this year. So $750 to help local students who have a passion for history. I want to thank especially Peter and Jack for all their hard work on the committee in selecting those 2 winners. With that being said, let's jump right into tonight's presentation. Tonight's speaker is Jamie Malanowski. He is a writer and an editor. He has served as the editor for several magazines, including Crime and Esquire, and has wrote several books. Most recently, Jamie has served as the speechwriter for Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. Tonight, his topic will be about his latest book, a biography entitled Commander Will Cushing, Daredevil, Hero of the Civil War. So with that, Jamie, thank you for coming out, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I am thrilled to be here. I have spoken about Commander Cushing to about 30 groups, but this is the first time I've spoken since the start of COVID, and I'm just really delighted to be back with people sharing this story. So thanks for coming out. Let me ask very quickly, you are all Civil War scholars. How many of you have heard of Commander Cushing? A couple of people. I'll tell you an interesting thing. If you had lived in the 19th century, you definitely would have heard of Commander Cushing. You know, by the end of the Civil War, if you lived in a big city like New York or Boston or Philadelphia, the front page of your paper would have a little box every day that would say what notable people were coming into town or departing town, and you would see Commander Cushing's name in that box. You would, 5 years, 10 years after the Civil War, you'd probably be buying the multi-volume histories of the war that were popular at the time, and they would have plates in them that would have pictures of the leaders, and in this particular plate, you see 8 Union naval heroes, and with the 7 admirals, Admiral Farragut, David Dixon Porter, there is the 1 junior officer, and that's Will Cushing. If you had served in the Army or the Navy, and 15 or 20 years you went to a meeting of the Grand Army of the Republic, you would find speakers talking about your service as young men in the fight, and how people like young Colonel Custer and young Will Cushing came out and performed so honorably and bravely. And everyone would know who he meant. And as late as 1903, if you go into certain banks on New Year's Day, they give you a new calendar, and some of them would have beautiful pictures of nature and stuff. But some of those calendars would have naval heroes. So there'd be Stephen Decatur and John Paul Jones and Will Cushing. So people knew who this guy was. But through the 20th century and later, his fame has ebbed. But what's ironic is that Will Cushing is more a man of our era than he was of that era. He was disrespectful. He was rebellious. He was independent. He was enterprising. He was rude. He was a million things that served him really well in battle. So if you like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, if you like Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, if you like Tom Cruise in Top Gun, you're going to love Will Cushing.
How about Hornblower?
How about Hornblower? Wrong Navy, but quite the guy. Will was born in Wisconsin. He was his mother was the second Mrs. Cushing. The paterfamilias of the family was Judge Cushing. He had a wife. They had 5 kids. The wife died. Judge married again. He had 6 kids, and then he died. Got while the getting was good. Will was the second youngest of the family, and very soon after Judge Cushing's death, Ma Cushing, who was a school teacher, moved her 6 kids up to New York State and opened a little school there. And what you found was that Will in the little town was the pride and peril of everyone who knew him. He was handsome, he was fun, he was always a rollicking good guy. He was the one who always, let's go for a ride, let's in the wagon, let's go horseback riding, let's go apple picking, let's do all these things. But he would always go too fast. He would always take the boat out on the lake and in the bad weather in the middle of the storm. He would always chase the snake down the snake hole and wrestle to bring it out. He got in so much trouble. There's a famous incident that when he was about 8 or 9 years old, he assembled all the little boys in town into a kind of little brigade, and they would pretend to do close order drill and this sort of thing, and march about, and it was all fun. And even though he was one of the younger fellows, he had the kind of leadership qualities that even the older fellows went along with him. As it happened, Will was the only one who went to his mother's school, and the other boys went to the public school in town. And Ma Cushing let her students out for recess 15 minutes earlier than the other school did. And Will would go over to the other school and whistle through the window, and all his guys would get up and run out of the classroom and go out and play. Well, the teacher at the other school was being driven crazy, as you can quite imagine. And he went and complained to Ma Cushing. And Ma said, if you can't discipline your students, don't come griping to me. So she kind of encouraged his independent ways. And sometimes it got him in trouble, sometimes he got away with it. But it kind of served him in good stead for his, when he became a leader. When Will was 15, an uncle who was a congressman got an appointment for Will to the Naval Academy. His older brother, Alonzo, Alonzo Cushing is a name many of you will recognize, was a little bit older than Will and got appointed to the military academy. So they were there at the same time. And it's quite remarkable to think that as a 15-year-old, Will went far away and was in the Naval Academy, which was a pretty terrible place. It was all discipline. You had all these young fellows. There was no sports. There was no social activity. It was a grind. You know, Admiral George Dewey, who went on to great things, talked about his midshipman days with just contempt and criticism for just how they disciplined the kids. And Will was one of the youngest. Not only was he the youngest in his class, until he became a senior, he was the youngest in the school. So I'm sure it put a lot of pressure on him. And he was, reacted rebelliously. He distinguished himself in nothing except getting demerits. 200 demerits get you expelled from the Naval Academy. He was consistently 190, 192, 195. It was always just shy. And he had a kind of, he was really a lot of fun. Too much fun. There was an Army sergeant who was on the staff who drilled the midshipmen in close order drill, and he was known as a real tyrant and bossed the kids around, and they really didn't like him, and he had the misfortune of having a stutter. So there was one day out on the parade ground when he had the midshipmen marching, and Will was in the front row, and he tried to give the order to halt, and he couldn't quite get it out. So it was halt, 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 and Will led the midshipmen right into the Severn River. That was one of the pranks that he pulled. There was another more serious incident where there was a Spanish teacher who was, for whatever reason, got on the wrong side, or Will really annoyed him. And there was a famous incident where the teacher was there, running the drills, the language drills, and he could see Will sitting in his seat sketching. And he would look up and he'd sketch, he'd look up and he'd sketch, and he'd look up and he'd sketch. And the teacher finally got annoyed and went over and grabbed the paper to see what it was, and it was a drawing of a donkey. And it said, "Mr. Professor, drawn from life." Well, that got the fellow really annoyed. But Will was getting away with all these things, and was, despite his record and his mediocre grades, was going through his senior year, and he started to get more and more serious his senior year. It was 1860, everyone was following the secession news, the election, they knew what was happening. They knew that they would be, they're midshipmen today, but they would be naval officers in just a few months. And he began to get more and more serious about things. And it was not hard to take it seriously. A third of the naval officers went with the Confederacy. Same percentage of midshipmen left the academy to go south. And so they were very aware of this. And Will tried to sort of straighten up a little bit, but he had run afoul of the number 2 guy at the academy, who was named Perry. And Perry was naval aristocracy. If you see a picture of him, he's straight up and down like a ruler. He's got a long goatee like a Goya painting, and it just looks every inch upright and serious. His one uncle was Matthew Perry, one uncle was Oliver Perry, his wife comes from naval captains, so he was really all about the Navy. And at the time, the Navy was suffering in national reputation. You know, the Army had already produced presidents, the U.S. Military Academy had been operating since 1803. It had a lot of national leaders. The Navy was more disreputable. People thought of the Navy as gangs on boats. They would float around and go ashore and fight, get in brawls. In fact, there was, in like 1848, a group of midshipmen ran away from the Naval Academy, took a boat, and went pirating in the Chesapeake Bay and ended up being hung for being pirates. So there was a lot of scandal. And Commander Perry wanted to kind of straighten things up and get to be modernize and bring the good reputation back to the Navy. And he really kind of zeroed in on Will as an example of a kind of disreputable fellow who needed to be straightened up. And one day, what happened in January is that Will failed his Spanish midterm. And Perry used as an excuse to throw him out of the Naval Academy, which is extraordinary when you think about it, because anybody with half a brain would know that if in just a few months you were going to need naval officers, and Will was almost fully trained naval officer, and they threw him out for failing a Spanish midterm, which, you know, wasn't navigation, it wasn't gunnery, it wasn't any of the practical tools that you would need as a naval officer. It was speaking Spanish. So Will was crushed, of course, as you can imagine. And he went to Washington and he appealed to the new Secretary of the Navy, Lincoln's newly installed Secretary of the Navy. I think it's remarkable to think what a small world it was that a midshipman could get an appointment with the Secretary of the Navy to talk about his expulsion, but he did. And Sumner Welles was very sympathetic to Will's position. He said later, you could just see that this was a young man of great ability who was just bored and restless and got himself into trouble. And you think he probably had that kind of insight because he had 4 sons of his own, and I think he probably had some insight into the male adolescent character. But he couldn't overrule his officers. So I'm sorry, I can't help you. But then it's an ill will that blows no one any good, and war broke out. So they called Will up and they said, well, we can't bring you back as, we'll bring you back at the lowest ranked officer that we can. And so Will was back in the Navy. And in 1861 and 1862, he lived the life of a lowly officer. He served on big ships, he served on little ships, he did patrol, he got out in the middle of the Chesapeake and looked for contraband, stood watch, saw a little bit of action, but didn't really have much going on. But in 1862, they really decided to put the blockade in force, and they got a lot more ships out in the sea, and a lot more ships means you need a lot more officers, and so Will finally got promoted to second lieutenant. Things were going much differently for his brother Alonzo. Alonzo was characteristically 180 degrees different than Will. Alonzo was diligent. Alonzo, worked really hard, got great grades, was popular with his professors and with his fellow students. And brothers were very close, but as different as night and day. And when Alonzo's at the military academy, he's theoretically in the class of 1862, but when war breaks out, they decided to hurry up that class, so there were two classes of 1861. The class of 1862 stuck around for 9 more weeks, finished all their work for what would have been their senior year, and then were put into the Army. So Alonzo graduates from the military academy on July 1st, 1861, and 3 weeks later is commanding a battery in the Battle of Bull Run. He distinguishes himself very early as a soldier of great aptitude, and he became a favorite of the general officers who would keep pulling him off his battery and using him for staff work, for scouting, for delivering messages, for deploying troops, reading the topography. So he really began to distinguish himself, and you read about him in doing well in Antietam and in Fredericksburg and in all the campaigns of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Army of the Potomac. Will finally gets his big break in the summer of 1862 when he's the second in command of a gunship in the rivers of Virginia. There's no one way to describe a gunship, because some of them were quite big and had big side wheel paddles and a lot of guns, and some were essentially tugboats, with a cannon on it. They had a need for a lot of boats, and they pretty much took anything that floated and put it out there. So one day they got the idea for an action. I forget the name of the river; it has skipped my mind, but. The idea was to have a joint Army-Navy operation. They were going to send a couple of gunboats up this river and get behind the Confederate force, and then the Union force would attack them, and the gunboats would open fire at the rear of the Confederate forces, and voila, victory. Right? Well, that was the plan, but it didn't quite work out that way. For one thing, getting through the river was tough going. It was a very narrow river, overgrown, trees, logs. At different times, the sailors had to get out, pull the ship around. Anyway, they finally get the gunships back behind the Confederate lines, and what do you think happens? The Army forgets to attack. And the Confederates look around and say, what are those boats doing there? So these were not heavily armed vessels, and the Confederates attacked them, put them under heavy fire. The sailors aboard the gunships were all hiding, taking cover, until finally Will steps out, and they had lots of supplies roped to the bulkheads and everything on board the ship, and Will steps into the line of fire, takes his sword, cuts the ropes that are tying a cannon to the ship, and he and some sailors get out and open fire with the cannon and drive the Confederates back. So it's the first time that Will Cushing's name gets mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous bravery. And people take notice. People began to say, well, he really did well there. So eventually he got his own little boat, And the adventures begin. And it's like reading, when you read these successive adventures, it's like reading a monthly comic book. You know, Will, you know, goes on a raiding party. Will sees a little fort, you know, a little encampment, and they overrun the encampment. You know, Will, you know, goes through what is very likely a tropical storm, if not a hurricane, and saves his ship. It's just one kind of boy's adventure after another, in which he keeps distinguishing himself and doing very well, and he gets more and more important assignments. By 1863, he's leading a little flotilla on the Namsecan River in Virginia, and there's these bluffs overlooking the river where the Confederates are stationed, and they have artillery up there, and Will's gunboats and these cannons, you know, for days at a time are having like this kind of running gun battle in the Namsecan River. One day, a sailor decides to go ashore to get some, you know, fresh meat or something, and is killed in action. And Will takes particular umbrage at this and decides that they're going to go after the people responsible for this casualty. So he takes like 80 sailors on shore, and they bring a little cannon that they're dragging around with them. And eventually they get tired of dragging the cannon around, and they liberate a burro from a farm, and they get the burro to pull the cannon with them. So they're going into a little town, and all of a sudden at the other end of the street is a detachment of Confederate cavalry. And Will deploys the sailors. They start to line the cannon up, and the burro bolts for the Confederate line, dragging the cannon after them. And Will says, well, where a donkey can go, a sailor can go. And he orders his men to charge, and the men run the cavalry out of town. So it's these kinds of amazing stories that keep mounting up and mounting up and mounting up and helping the legend of Will Cushing grow and grow. Alonzo, meanwhile, continues to serve with distinction. He's fighting in Chancellorsville, and then on the 1st of July, he's with, bless you. Thank you. Winfield Hancock in Maryland, and they hear the gunfire coming from Gettysburg, and Winfield Hancock gets an order to go into Gettysburg and stop the rout of the Union forces that is taking place. And he takes Alonzo with him, and they spend day one of the Battle of Gettysburg on Cemetery Hill, you know, reestablishing order and recreating the Union line and putting a stop to the Confederate advance that day. Day two, Alonzo is back with his battery on Seminary Ridge, and he doesn't see much action. He does, some of those Confederate units attack past the peach orchard and the wheat field and start coming up Cemetery Ridge. He does get into a little action there, but not very much action. And on day three, as most of you know, it turns out he's on Cemetery Ridge again. And when Robert E. Lee says to Longstreet, focus your men on that little copse of trees, it's Alonzo's Cushing battery that is under the little copse of trees. So day three, Pickett's charge happens. You know about the bombardment. Alonzo's battery of 6 guns is severely damaged, almost wiped out. There's 1 gun left, and a lot of his men are lost, but Alonzo has got a couple guys left, and he says to Union officer, if you give me a couple of your fellows, we'll roll the cannon up to this little fence here, and we'll defend from there. So they're firing. He gets shot once in the genitals, and it's obvious to everyone that he's in a very bad way. You know, the general says, "Cushing, why don't you go to the rear?" He says, "No, I'm going to stay." He gets shot again in the arm. The Confederates get closer and closer and closer. He's leaning on his sergeant, Sergeant Ruger, continuing to fire. Confederates are as close, finally, as I am to you. He puts in a double load of canister, and then gets shot in the mouth and is killed. And Sergeant Ruger says, "Fire." And they fire the double canister into the advancing units, and that's the end of the advance, pretty nearly. It took a long time for that very staunch defense of Alonzo Cushing to be recognized, but in 2014, he of course was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama. Will, by that point, he was on leave. His ship had been taken to the Philadelphia Naval Yard for repairs, and he had the run of the city, and he was of course extremely upset at the loss of his brother. And the Navy had put him up in a hotel in downtown Philadelphia, and there was a gubernatorial campaign going on at that time, and Pennsylvania was a big Lincoln state, but the Democrats had a very strong candidate and were giving the guy a real run for his money. Well, it turns out the hotel that Will was staying in was Democratic Party headquarters. And he was checking in or at the desk for some reason, and one of those Democratic Party operatives, turned out to be a pharmacist, made a joke about how, oh gosh, they're so desperate, they're starting to ship them in from the front lines, and Will chuckled and started to beat on the guy. Attacked him, got in a fist fight. Eventually, they had to call the police. Put him in the clink for the night. He apologized, said he was sorry, everything was okay. Some time goes by. They finished the repairs on the vessel. It's getting time for him to take the ship back down to Hampton Roads. And Will says to his second in command, "Why don't you take it? I've got some business to take care of." And he gets a carriage. He goes around to the pharmacy. He goes in. He beats the pharmacist with a cane. Goes back out, goes over to the train station, takes a train south. So that's grief counseling, 1863 style. So every story needs a good villain, and this story has got a great villain. When the Confederacy seceded, they decided they needed a Navy. They appointed a Secretary of the Navy, and the only drawback is they had no ships. No ships. So they were very fortunate at capturing the Norfolk Naval Yard, where they managed to refloat some sunken vessels, one of which was the Merrimack, which they renamed the Virginia. And for as regressive a political institution as the Confederacy was, they had one very forward-thinking leader, and that was their Secretary of the Navy. It was a guy named Stephen Mallory, who had been a U.S. Senator. And he knew that because they had no Navy, that they had to invest in force equalizers, what we would call asymmetrical warfare. So he invested in submarines, he invested in developing mines, and he invested in ironclads. They raised the Merrimack, they put what is essentially, the way they made ironclads was it was like aluminum siding. They put slats down and then they tacked the iron onto the outside of it. And in March 1862, they sent it down into Hampton Roads, and it wreaked havoc on the Union Navy for a day. It was a thrill for the Confederacy, till the next day the Monitor showed up and fought the Virginia to a standstill. Nonetheless, Mallory said, this is the only thing we can do is build ironclads. And so all throughout the South, anywhere there was a port, they started to build ironclads. And they built about 50 of them over the course of the war. And most of them were junk. They had rotting timbers in them, they were overweight, they couldn't move. Some, they ended up just being floating batteries. Some just sank. They had some that patrolled the James River pretty successfully but didn't have any other good purpose to it. But they had one that really worked, and it was called the Albemarle. And it was built, ironically, in a cornfield off the Tar River in North Carolina. And the Confederate captain who was in charge, they had a naval architect down there, and they had a lot of pine, and they built the frame of the ship. And Captain Cook, went all throughout the area. He was called the Ironmonger Captain. And he took every bit of metal that he could find. Hinges off of barn doors, ladies' bracelets, you know, whatever he could find, he got the metal in, and they made the sheeting for the ship. And it took them a while, but in 1864 it was finally ready to go. And he floated it down the Tar River and into the Roanoke River, and it was they were going to take a Union installation. North Carolina is a funny state. I never really thought about North Carolina in any way, but you know, it's got the coastal area, which is really broken up with a lot of little inlets and bays and stuff, and so it was a great place for smugglers, for blockade runners to come in, because they could evade the blockade ships and then hide in the inlet. And then you go in the west, there's all these mountains, and running east-west are lots of rivers out of the mountains down to the sea. And it makes maneuvering for the Army very difficult. So they put a kind of low priority. The Union Army put a low priority on taking North Carolina, even though it was a great place. The blockade runners would come in and they would go into New Bern and use the railroads to take the equipment up to Lee's army. But they did they did penetrate. The Union Army get about 10 miles inland, and they had an installation, and the goal of the Albemarle was to come down and support a Confederate attack on that installation and drive the Yankees out. So it starts to come down. Now, you know, it's really hard to hide reports that there's a gigantic iron ship with a huge cannon and a big claw on the front. So the Union Navy knew they were coming, and they were prepared. They sent 2 gunships to meet it. And their plan was to stretch a big net between them and kind of wrap the Albemarle up and then board it like they were, you know, Roman sailors out of a scene in Ben-Hur, and take it that way. Well, the Ironmonger Captain, this wasn't his first time in combat. He said, "Oh, geez, I'm not going to sail right into the middle of that net." Instead, he sails right into one of the Union gunships, smashes it. And in fact, he smashes into it and goes so deeply, when the ship sinks, it drags the Albemarle down with it. And if the river had been a little deeper, that might have been the end of the story and we wouldn't have the rest of the tale to tell. But it was a relatively shallow thing. They came down, they bounced, and the Albemarle came back up, right next to the other Yankee gunship, who's there firing, and the shells are bouncing off the Albemarle. Nothing's happening. And finally, they fire a shell. The shell bounces off the iron skin, lands at the foot of the captain, and blows up. And so that's the end of the battle. The Yankee gunboat limps away, and the Confederates are overjoyed. We've got this new weapon, works like a charm. It's really terrific. And they're very excited. Now, the ship has got some problems. It's not very nimble, it's not very navigable, it's kind of hard to steer. But Braxton Bragg, the terrible general who's in charge of the North Carolina district, says, let's take this show on the road. We're going to take the Albemarle down to the Roanoke River, into the Sound, and then come up the New Bern River and do the same thing and get rid of all the Union vessels there. Well, again, the Union Navy gets wind of this, and they send out 10 ships. And so in Albemarle Sound, there's this big battle. And it's a lot of shooting without a lot of damage, because they stay far enough away from one another that they're not really inflicting much harm. And even when the Yankee ships fire and hit the Albemarle, the shots bounce off. However, there comes a point in the battle where the one Union vessel lines up and gets a direct run at the Albemarle. Now, forgive me for having not described the Albemarle, but the Albemarle is essentially a normal hull of a ship with a flat surface, a floor essentially, and then what's called a casemate in it. And the casemate is where the two big guns and then officers are. So it's kind of like a hull of a vessel with a cheese plate and a hunk of Edam on it that's got big cannons in it. So this Union captain says, I'm going to ram the Albemarle. I'm going to hit it right in the casemate and decapitate it. So he revs up his engines to full speed. He gives the order for a brace. Everybody on the ship lays down and braces themselves. They come racing full speed ahead, right for the Albemarle, and they miss the casemate by this much and end up sitting on the flat part of the vessel. And they very calmly turn the thing around and begin pumping fire into the Union vessel, and it has to skulk away, barely getting there because its boilers have been shot up. And that effectively marks the end of the battle. And the Albemarle goes back upriver, and the Union vessels steam away best they can. But again, the Confederacy is overjoyed. They have not been having much success on the battlefields, but man, they are excited about this because it went 10-1. We beat them. We drove them away. We stood our own. They knew we were coming, and we still took them on. So they were very thrilled about this, and you know, they were very excited. They're very thrilled about things. And the Union Navy, in the same way, was really confused, perplexed, depressed, all those feelings. And they came up with, they thought, well, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do about this? Maybe we'll bring a monitor in. No, we can't get it over the sandbar there. Well, maybe we'll bring in the equipment to build a monitor. No, we can't. There's too much stuff. We can't do that. They tried all these different ideas, and somebody said, maybe what we need to do is send a team of fellows up there in a boat with a bomb and blow the thing up. And they went to various officers and asked them if you would undertake this mission. And I said, no, are you crazy? It's a suicide mission. I'm not going to do that. But one day, Samuel Lee, Admiral Samuel Lee of the Union Navy, Robert E. Lee's cousin, is sitting there reading all these reports. And he is reading about Will Cushing. Will Cushing and a group of fellows go all the way up the New Bern River on a scouting mission and then have a daring escape. Will Cushing and an attachment go across and capture a Confederate officer out of the camp and bring him back for questioning. Will Cushing does this, Will Cushing does that. He says, bring me Will Cushing. Cushing comes in, he says, Cushing, you know, we've got this ship up there and it's causing all kinds of hell. What do you think we ought to do about it? Will says, I think we ought to send a group of guys up there with a bomb and blow the thing up. He says, you're my man. So he sends Will up to New York City with the orders to get a couple of big Indian rubber boats and bring them back to be used up there. So he gets up to the Navy Yard in New York City, talks to the man in charge, and I don't know if you people know anybody from New York, but you can't tell somebody from New York anything. And so he said, no, you don't want India rubber boats. No, no, no. I got this swell picket boat, 35 feet long, got a little cannon in the front, got this motor, you know, engine. It's going to take you up there, hold 10 guys. It's going to be terrific. You'll love it. It's the vessel you need. I says, okay, that's pretty good. And he says, and I've also got a spar torpedo. Well, what's a spar torpedo? Well, a spar torpedo is just the greatest thing. Like its name, when we think of torpedoes, most of us think of the bomb-shaped thing that submarines shoot out and along. They use the word torpedo in the way we would use the word mine. It's a spherical thing with explosives inside, with detonating points, and it explodes on contact, or with a detonation pin. And well, it's a smart torpedo. What's the deal? He says, yeah, you put it on 2 spars at the front of your vessel, and you lower the thing into the water, and it floats up to your target, and you pull a detonation cord, and it sets the thing off. I says, well, what am I doing while it's floating up there? He says, well, you know, catch up on your correspondence, read your email, whatever you do. So Will takes a couple of these spar torpedoes out into the Hudson River and tests them. And one after another, they fail. It doesn't blow up, it sinks. You have this cord that you're supposed to pull to detonate, and the cord breaks, or the pin breaks. Finally, he gets one to blow up. He says, "Okay, I'll take a spar torpedo." So he in his usual fashion, he tells his ensigns to take the picket boats back to Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, and he gets in a train and he goes up and he visits his mother. And when he arrives, he's just full of hijinks. He is on horseback and he rides his horse up the front porch steps and into the kitchen. Hello, I'm here, Will is home. And all the cousins are laughing, everybody's laughing, it's all fun and that kind of stuff. And they think, oh, good old Will, so great, we haven't seen him in so long, it's just great to see him. But as a couple of days go by, his mood ebbs, and it seems clear that he's got a lot on his mind. And in the middle of the week, they're having a party for him, and very, somberly, there's a young lady there. It's a friend of the family. It's not someone who he has ever courted, but he takes, she's wearing a locket, and he reaches around and unhooks the locket from her neck and puts it around his own neck. He says, that's for good luck. Well, people are kind of shocked. This is the 19th century. We just don't go taking young ladies' lockets like that unless you intend to marry them and have 6 kids. So everyone's kind of looking and saying, wow, Will, that's different. The next morning, he takes his mother out for a carriage ride. And they go out on the hills, and he tells her what the mission is. He says, they're sending me up the river to blow this thing up, and I think there's a good chance that when it's over, you won't see Will Cushing anymore. She says, why you? You've served, you've done all this action, your brother Howard is out there serving, your brother Alonzo is dead, why you? He says, Mother, they don't have anybody else. And then they pray. And Will then heads back to North Carolina. So late in October, he's got his 2 little vessels, and they begin heading upriver. They get to the point in the river. The river is pretty narrow by standards, and it's overhung with all these gum and cypress trees. And it's a dark night, it's raining. And so you just imagine this kind of close atmosphere as they creep quietly up the river. They see the wreckage of the first ship that the Albemarle sank, and Will tells the one boat to stay there and cover the retreat. And he and his boat, 10 men, the spar torpedo, they continue to creep up. They get outside of the town. They can now, for the first time, see the Albemarle silhouetted. There's Confederate troops on the shore. You know, they have it's 2 a.m., you know, they have very dim embers going, and Will continues to creep up. And as he gets very close to the Albemarle, for the first time, he sees something that intelligence had not told him about, which is that the Albemarle is protected against this very kind of attack with a log boom. There's chains of logs surrounding the ship. Now, Will, I think, had intended not to sink the Albemarle, but to steal it. You know, a lot of the hornblower Navy type adventures involve sending a group, because sailors traditionally, when they were in port, didn't sleep on the ship. They were just lightly guarded. You would send a force in, overrun them very quickly, kill or neutralize them in some way, and then steal the ship. These steamships had their engines banked at all times so that you could quickly fire them up and go. And I'm sure that was Will's plan, to try to steal the thing. But he ain't stealing this thing. He's not going to pass the log boom. So he starts to think what to do, and at that point, a loyal Confederate dog starts barking. Woof, y'all, woof! And he alerts the Confederate forces that there's an intruder out there, and suddenly the camp comes alive. There's yelling, there's shouting, there's people, who's out there, who's gonna go? And Will says, well, we'll find out in just a minute. So he revs up his engines, he scoots along the log boom, you know, looking for a gap of some kind in it, circles around, puts full speed ahead, and goes straight at the Albemarle. And he's looking for a chink in the boom that maybe he can crash through, that maybe it's been lubricated by moss or something like that, and he can try to push above it. And so he comes in full speed ahead, boom, 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 pow! It half works. He gets halfway across the log boom and then is stuck there. And by this point, Confederate sailors have gotten on board the ship, they're aroused, and they turn around the big gun and they aim it, and they're aiming to blow Will out of the water where he so carefully is stuck. But Will stands at the prow of his vessel and begins to lower the spar torpedo. On the vessel, the captain is saying, lower your gun, lower your gun, lower your gun. But the problem is, the gun is inside the casemate, the barrel protrudes through a window, there is a frame around the window, and you can only get the thing so low. and they can't bring it to fully bear on the little picket boat. But there's all this chaos, shooting, firing. A bullet goes through the elbow of Will's coat. Another one takes off the heel of his boot. Another one rips out the back of his jacket. The captain on the ship, lower, lower, lower. Will's lowering his thing, lower, lower, lower. Chaos, chaos, chaos. Finally, just as the spar torpedo reaches under the Albemarle, the captain on the ship yells, "Fire!" Will pulls the pin, and there's these massive explosions. Will said he could feel the cannonball go right over his head. And nobody knows what happens, like dead silence for a minute. What is happening? And nobody knows. I'm sure everyone is concussed, you know? So because the men on the picket boat, they're just like sitting there. And Will yells, "Abandon ship, every man for himself." He takes off his coat, he dives into the water. On the Albemarle, the captain says to his engineer, "Go down and tell me how big the damage is." The guy comes up in a couple minutes, he says, "There's a hole down there big enough to drive a carriage through." And in about 4 minutes, the Albemarle is at the bottom of the river. So, Will begins swimming for shore. Most of his men are captured right there. They don't even get out of the boat, essentially. Will begins swimming, and he finds one of his men, who like dies almost immediately. And Will begins making his way down the river. It's about 8 miles from where the Navy is. He swims to shore and essentially collapses in a bunch of reeds and sleeps there for a while. When he wakes up, a black man is standing over him, obviously an enslaved person. And Will says, "What happened?" And he says, "That boat is done gone sink, and if they catch you, they're going to kill you." So, and at that point, Will can hear that there are posses of men out looking for him, looking for survivors. There's guys in the water looking for him. You can hear men on horseback looking for him in the weeds. So he's creeping down, crawling through the mud, crawling through the reeds, eluding these fellas, hiding. He finally gets to a point where he sees a little group of a little posse standing on shore. And this is the detail that I find most remarkable in the whole story. He steals their boat. He steals their boat, and he begins rowing. And he rows, and he rows, and he rows, and he rows. Gets blisters. Finally, about 10 o'clock at night, he reaches back in Albemarle Sound, and he's exhausted and collapsed. And the Union Navy doesn't know what had happened. They know there was an explosion. The vessel that he left to protect their retreat heard the explosion and said, well, they must all be dead, so they left. And down in the Navy, they're expecting Confederate retaliation. So they're all braced for retaliation. So they hear the sound out there. They see this little rowboat, and they send down an ensign and they say, Cushing, is that you? And he says, yes. Yes, is it I? And he said, is it done? He said, yes. Yes, it's done. So they bring Will up from the rowboat, bandage his hands, meets the admiral, he gives his report, and that night he sits on the deck of the ship and drinking brandy and watching as the entire Union fleet fires rockets into the air to celebrate his accomplishment. And he is not yet 22 years old. So that's my story. I got interested in Will's story when I was 8 years old, and it was the centennial of the Civil War. And to mark the centennial, Life magazine produced a six-issue series on the Civil War, and one of the highlights of the first issue was a portfolio of illustrations by noted magazine artists of key moments in the war. And at 8 years old, I was blown away by this huge, beautiful painting of Will Cushing sinking the Albemarle. And that's what got me pursuing this. You can pass this around if you like, or if it's awkward for you. And I'm thrilled that the son of the artist, I managed to get in touch with him, and he gave me permission to use the painting on the cover of my book. So any questions that we can take for a little while? Yes?
Just wondered, he was 15 years old when he was accepted into the Navy.
Yes.
What was their age requirement?
15 years old, I think. I don't know if anybody tried younger than that. But his uncle was a congressman and made the thing work. So, and I think, you know, what we now know about psychology is you can see how difficult that must have been on such a young person in such an environment, and probably brought out a lot of that rebelliousness. Yes?
Did anyone besides Will survive from that?
Well, only 2 men of the group died, and 1 other man escaped. He showed up about a week later. And so the others were taken prisoner and were POWs until, well, just before the war ended. My favorite, Will became a great hero after this. He was on the cover of Harper's Weekly. He had parades in his hometown. He got the key to the city to New York. He got something called the Thanks of Congress, which is a thing that they don't do anymore. But only about 50 people ever received it. And you would get the Thanks of Congress like Ulysses Grant. You received the Thanks of Congress for conquering Vicksburg. So it was really a thing that was generally reserved for rarely eminent people. He was one of only 2 junior officers who received it during the war. And so he had all these honors, all this celebration. About 6 weeks after he sinks the Albemarle, he's back in action. He goes down and he joins this great armada assembled by David Dixon Porter to attack and conquer Fort Fisher. And by now he's got his own vessel. He's been promoted. He's the youngest lieutenant commander in the Navy. And David Dixon Porter wants to celebrate this moment of what he expects will be a great triumph, and he gets Alexander Gardner to take photographs of his captains, and which Alexander does. And there's a great famous picture of Porter and his 10 captains or 12 captains, and Will is among them. But Gardner, not being a fool, decides that he wants to take a picture of the hero of the moment, because he's got Will Cushing there. And so he takes a picture of Will standing on the side. And it's just such a great picture. They found it after my book was published, but it's Will just there, man, just at his James Dean best, you know, just leaning on the side there. And if you look, the favorite part is that standing behind him, like, a cartoon character, is David Dixon Porter staring at this guy who's 22 and a bigger hero than he is, and it's just a great little picture, I think, of this hero. So, any other questions? Yes.
So what happened? Why did most Americans not know Will Cushing?
Well, Will did not live very long. He died when he was 33. He stayed in the Navy, he served, he had some more adventures, some incredible adventures in Cuba. But he died, he had a diagnosis that was called rheumatism of the hip. He had great pain in his hip. What was it really? Was it cancer? Was it some other kind of I think anyway, it was tremendously painful. He had just been promoted to commander, youngest commander in the Navy. He was the number 2 at the Washington Naval Yard, and he was so deeply in pain that he was like raving, which gave rise to a lot of stories that he was kind of a crazy man, crazy war lover, did all these crazy things, and was crazy at the end. But he died at 33, and so there was no second act, you know. And if had he lived, as you know, it would have been Will Cushing leading the fleet in Manila Bay. It would have been Will Cushing, you know, leading the Great White Fleet for Theodore Roosevelt. He was so young, he would have had another 40 years of service or so. Or he could have charted his own path. The whole second half of the 19th century is full of presidents who were Union generals. Why not a Union naval hero as president? We had to wait until John F. Kennedy for that to happen, but it could have been a different future. So I think because he had no second act, you know, he kind of faded from view. Yes?
What I would say with that is because he wasn't there to toot his own horn, that he wasn't able to, you know, talk to and explain what he did. It was pushed under the rug by the captains who were probably over him.
It could have been. You know, there was a lot of demobilization after the war. A lot of people lost their jobs or lost plum assignments. He continued to have, you know, important assignments, and so maybe there was some kind of jealousy. It's certainly possible.
And because again, the Medal of Honor had just come into existence, so they really, I mean, what most of the individuals from the Civil War who we have on our wall from the Medal of Honor actually didn't receive this until 1897,
right.
1900.
Will did not receive a Medal of Honor.
But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So long for those acts.
Right.
If there was nobody pushing for him, then it wasn't yet.
And certainly that was the story. That was one of the stories attached to why it took so long for Alonzo Cushing to be cited, that there was nobody pushing. And they, in 2014, they took a really long time to find a blood relative of the Cushing, of Alonzo, to be present at the White House to receive the medal. Alonzo wasn't married. They had the brother Howard, who served with distinction and fought in the Indian Wars, was killed without children. They finally found, you know, a niece of their youngest sister who represented the family. Will had 2 daughters who both died without marrying or having children, so there was no heirs in that side of the family. Yes?
Did you ever marry the girl who took the locket?
You know, it's usually a romantic young lady in the audience who asks that question, but I'm glad you did. You know, he married another lady from his own town, but not the bracelet lady. But here's the thing, you know, when after the bomb went off and he took off his coat to escape, a Confederate officer went and retrieved the coat and kept it in his room, and shortly thereafter, when Union troops came up the river and reconquered the town, they found Will's coat, and sewn into the collar was the locket. So it obviously worked.
Does that coat still survive?
I'm not aware that it does. You can go down to the Naval Academy Museum and see a number of things that belong to Will. And I have not visited the Cushing family home in New York, but they've got some things too. I don't know what though.
Well, thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome.
That was a fantastic presentation, so thank you for coming down.